The hall was packed, not just with diplomats but with a tension thick enough to slice. New York's fall wind rattled the UN's glass walls, but inside, it was J.D. Vance who brought the chill. He stood tall, in his trademark smirk and Midwestern charm, addressing the General Assembly like it was a campaign rally. Africa doesn't need more rebellion, Vance declared, voice booming. It needs American order. It needs structure. And let's be honest, who else will give it that? Some nodded. Others winced. But one man leaned forward in his seat, elbows on the table, gaze fixed like a sniper. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The Burkinabe leader wore no tie, no polished shoes. Just a military-style jacket with a Pan-African pin and a face carved from defiance. He whispered nothing to his delegation. He didn't need to. His silence had already started a storm. Vance continued, unaware, or perhaps unbothered. You all talk about independence, he said, eyes sweeping the room, but what has that brought you? Chaos. Corruption. Coup after coup. We don't need more slogans. We need results. And America is ready to provide them, whether you're ready or not. Traoré stood. Slowly. Like the ground itself was rising with him. His voice didn't need to rise to be heard. He only said one sentence. We remember your chaos. The chamber froze. And then erupted. Gasps. Whispers. Camera shutters clicking like gunfire. Every ambassador who had ever walked the fine line between diplomacy and indignation felt that line crack beneath their feet. J.D. Vance tried to speak again, but this time, his mic crackled, either from interference or fate. It didn't matter. Because all eyes had turned to Traoré. And Traoré was just beginning. Traoré's words didn't just echo through the chamber, they cracked it open. Delegates shifted in their seats. Vance clenched his jaw, trying to reclaim the floor, but the energy had shifted. The hunter had become the hunted. I'll be brief, Traoré said, stepping forward, voice cool as steel. When you speak of American order, you speak of drone strikes, sanctions, and soldiers. You speak of stolen elections and leaders who kneel, not to their people, but to your banks. Some clapped. Some didn't dare. You talk about chaos, Mr. Vance, Traoré continued. But your order turned Libya into a battlefield. Your order starved Sudan with your policies. Your order built prisons, not schools. And now you want to sell that same order to us, again. He walked slowly past the American delegation. A dramatic pause, like a general inspecting enemy lines. No notes. No teleprompter. Just rage refined into rhetoric. You call our resistance coups. But we call them awakenings. You call our leaders rebels. We call them sons and daughters of freedom. And we are not waiting for your approval. A murmur surged through the room. African ambassadors, long silent under years of foreign manipulation, began to straighten in their seats. Traoré turned his gaze directly to Vance. You want to lead Africa? He asked, voice sharpened like a blade. Try leading Flint, Michigan first. Laughter. Real, unfiltered, even from those who moments ago had stayed cautious. Vance's smirk cracked, just for a second. Then came the defensive grin, the type American politicians wear when their mask starts slipping. America doesn't bring chaos, Vance shot back. We bring civilization. Phones, roads, hospitals. Order. Traoré didn't blink. Then why do your hospitals bankrupt your people? Why do your roads lead to nowhere for the poor? And why does your order always come with a gun in one hand, and a contract in the other? Silence again. But it wasn't awkward. It was revelation. Traoré's voice was steady, yet it carried a storm. The world is tired, Mr. Vance. Tired of lectures from a country that can't keep its own house in order. Tired of aid wrapped in chains. Tired of wars fought for freedom, but always far from your own shores. He stepped forward again, closer to the center, commanding the room without needing permission. The translator had stopped. Everyone understood him now, because truth speaks its own language. You say we don't belong at the table, he continued, addressing not just Vance but every power that had dismissed Africa. Yet every empire on this earth was built with our blood. You wear suits sewn with our cotton, drink from cups carved with our gold, live in towers lit by our uranium. And still, you think we should sit in silence? J.D. Vance shifted again, visibly uncomfortable. He tried to speak, but Traore held up a single hand, not in disrespect, but like a conductor pausing a broken instrument. Let me finish, Traore said calmly. Because for too long, Africa was the unfinished sentence in every summit, the ignored voice in every resolution. But now, we speak, loud, and unapologetically. A few representatives from the global south began nodding. A delegate from Brazil tapped his pen thoughtfully. An envoy from Indonesia whispered something to her aide, eyes fixed on Traore. You talk about African stability like we're your experiment, he continued. But when our leaders choose independence, you call them threats. When they nationalize resources, you send in advisors, or assassins. When they unite, you divide. Traore's eyes scanned the room like a spotlight in a theater. But your tactics are old. And your narrative is cracked. Because there's a new generation now. We've read the contracts. We've seen the coups. We've buried the journalists, the teachers, the children. And we are no longer asking for a seat. We're flipping the table. At those final words, silence fell, thick and absolute. J.D. Vance leaned back, face expressionless, but behind the mask, the unease was palpable. No one interrupted. No one laughed. Because the world had just witnessed something rare, not a speech, but a reckoning. And it wasn't over yet. The silence didn't last. A single clap broke it, measured, deliberate. It came from the delegation of South Africa, then another, from Bolivia. A ripple followed, Ghana, Algeria, Vietnam, even Turkey. The applause was not loud, but it was sharp, purposeful, and entirely unsanctioned. No one had expected it, especially not J.D. Vance. He glanced around, stiff and still smiling, but that smile now strained, like glass under pressure. Traore didn't bow. He didn't acknowledge the applause. He didn't need to. He stood calmly, letting the moment hang, letting the discomfort settle in the chests of those used to control. He had said what needed to be said, and that was enough. But Vance wasn't finished. So what? He finally snapped, voice brittle. You think anger makes you right? You think parading your rage makes you a leader? Traore turned toward him slowly. I think silence makes you an accomplice, he said. And pretending neutrality while funding war is cowardice dressed as diplomacy. The air turned sharp. You talk of leadership? Traore added. Then show me the courage to stand against injustice, not just when it suits your headlines. Where was your voice when Gaza burned? When Niger stood alone? When your drones struck weddings instead of targets? Vance bristled. This is a forum for peace. Then act like it, Traore shot back. Because peace isn't a slogan. It's justice. It's dignity. It's sovereignty. And you've denied all three to Africa for decades. The room held its breath. Then Traore walked back to his seat, not hurried, not triumphant, simply calm. And that calm, more than anything, unnerved them. Vance said nothing more. He didn't need to. Because every word after that would sound like noise next to Traore's clarity. And in that stillness, the world saw the shift, from the old guard who lectured, to a new voice that demanded answers. A new voice that wasn't going anywhere. Within hours, headlines began spinning out of control. Traore disrespects U.S. Senator at Global Summit. African populist clashes with American patriot. J.D. Vance silenced by radical firebrand. But the footage told a different story, one that millions were already sharing on every platform. Unedited. Uncut. Unfiltered. Traore, steady and precise. Vance, rattled and reactive. And the applause, faint but undeniable, erupting right after Traore's closing line. By midday, commentators on CNN, Fox, and MSNBC were dissecting the exchange, each with their own spin. It was a disgrace, barked one former ambassador. Traore has no respect for diplomatic norms. Another countered, he said what many in the global south are thinking. Maybe it's time someone did. In West Africa, the reaction was fire. Traoré's words were replayed in schools, cafes, military camps, and on village radios. TikTok flooded with edits of the moment, some overlaid with thunder, others with captions like, "Speak for the voiceless." Even children mimicked his voice in street chants. And in Washington? J.D. Vance retreated into silence. No press conferences. No statements. Just a short post on X. Sometimes, the loudest person in the room is also the most afraid. But it backfired. Replies exploded with side-by-side clips of the encounter. One viral comment read, "You looked afraid." He looked like a leader. Meanwhile, Traoré gave no interviews. No clarifications. He simply flew to Dakar the next morning, where a crowd of thousands welcomed him like a returning king. No red carpet. Just fists raised, flags waving, and voices echoing the words that now defined him. Then why are they cheering? Because they were. Because someone finally said what they couldn't. Because, for once, the global South had a voice loud enough to shake the walls of Western power. And his name was Ibrahim Traoré. The next morning in Washington, D.C., the air was thick with unease. In the halls of the Senate, J.D. Vance walked with his usual sharp stride, but aides noticed the slight tremble in his hand, the unusually long pause before he answered even routine questions. Senators whispered. Staffers watched the clip again and again. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew, he had been rattled. In the White House, National Security Council members reviewed Traoré's statement on loop. He said, "If I don't belong here, then why are they cheering?" one aide muttered. It wasn't just a soundbite, it was a challenge. And that challenge had landed like a grenade. Because for the first time in years, a leader from Africa, young, bold, unapologetic, had stood at the most powerful table on earth and flipped the dynamic. Not with weapons, not with money, but with truth. President Biden was briefed. CIA analysts drafted profiles. Pentagon brass murmured words like rising influence, ideological threat, potential disruptor. But Traoré wasn't a warlord. He wasn't a radical cleric. He was a statesman, one whose words had now mobilized millions. That made him far more dangerous. Meanwhile, Traoré remained silent. He knew the real power of silence. He let the world speak for him. Let the media argue, let the officials scramble. Let the people decide. And the people were speaking. African youth posted selfies with captions like, "I belong." College students in New York held spontaneous campus forums discussing colonialism and representation. Even in South America, activists referenced Traoré's quote in protests against IMF policies. The echo was global. And J.D. Vance? He tried to pivot. He appeared on a podcast 3 days later, leaning back in his chair, attempting a smirk. The guy's a populist. He's good with theatrics. But let's not pretend he's changing the world. But no one laughed. Because deep down, they all felt it, something had shifted. And it started with a sentence. Then why are they cheering? Traoré didn't return to Ouagadougou quietly. He returned as a storm. As his plane descended over the red earth of Burkina Faso, tens of thousands had already flooded the tarmac, waving flags, chanting his name, holding signs that read, "We belong. Our voice. Our time. Traoré speaks, we rise." But the energy wasn't just national, it was continental. Across Africa, news stations looped his confrontation with J.D. Vance. In Kenya, a panel of journalists called it a historic moment in the struggle for post-colonial dignity. In Nigeria, students painted murals of Traoré standing tall before the U.S. Senate seal. In South Africa, a retired ANC general was quoted saying, "This is what Mandela dreamed of, a son of Africa unafraid to speak truth to empire." And Traoré? He was already planning what came next. In his war room. Less a traditional command center and more a vibrant mix of scholars, economists, and strategists, he laid out the next step, the New Africa Summit. Not hosted in Paris. Not dictated by Brussels. Not whispered through Washington. It would take place in Timbuktu. Symbolic. Sacred. A city of history and stolen books, of erased memory and enduring pride. There, Traore would invite leaders not as inferiors, but as equals. From Cuba to Palestine, from Venezuela to Congo. Not just to talk, but to act. "We don't need a seat at their table," he said in the first summit draft speech. "We're building our own table, with no chains beneath it." And the people heard him. Even before the summit began, flights to Mali booked out. Musicians wrote songs in his honor. Artists sketched portraits of him atop broken colonial statues. But not everyone was cheering. In the Pentagon, meetings grew longer. In Langley, intelligence reports warned of a new power block. One memo, marked confidential, stated, "If left unchecked, Traore's influence will restructure global South alliances within the decade." In private, J.D. Vance told donors, "This isn't over. He embarrassed us once. It won't happen again." But deep down, even he knew. It already had. The summit began under a scorching Sahel sun. No red carpets, no symphony orchestras, no photo ops with forced smiles. Instead, a wide circle of wooden chairs on the sands of Timbuktu. No one sat higher than the rest. No translator booths separating tongues. No flags dividing dreams. Traore stood in the center, barefoot. "Welcome," he said, "to the new world." Around him sat those who had, for decades, been told they didn't belong: revolutionaries, scholars, tribal elders, women who had led protests in the streets of Tehran and Bogota, Tuareg nomads, Zapatista commanders, descendants of those who had once been bought and sold by empires, now speaking freely, equally, unafraid. No press was allowed, yet the world was watching, because what happened in Timbuktu echoed louder than any NATO summit. Traore introduced the first resolution. The end of extraction without justice. Africa's gold, oil, cobalt, coltan, no longer would they be stolen for pennies while children died mining them. No longer would puppet presidents sign away futures in exchange for Western approval. A delegate from the Congo raised his voice, "We're not commodities. We are continents." Thunderous applause followed. A Palestinian woman, her hijab caught in the desert breeze, stood and said, "We don't want sympathy. We want solidarity." Traore nodded. "Then let's build it, with steel, not sand." But just as momentum swelled, a coded message buzzed into his aide's phone. It was from Ouagadougou intelligence: "White House wants to speak. Urgent. They're watching." Traore smirked. He walked to the camera broadcasting the summit to the world and leaned in, eyes locked to the lens. "To those watching from Washington," he said, voice calm as fire, "this isn't rebellion. It's resurrection. You thought you broke us, but we were roots. And now, we rise." A silence held the desert still. Then came roars of approval, not just in Timbuktu, but online, on streets, in town squares from Dakar to Dhaka. And in the White House Situation Room, a U.S. general whispered, "We lost Africa." The president clenched his fist. Not yet. But deep down, he knew. They didn't flip the table. Traore shattered it, and burned the blueprint. The fallout from Timbuktu rippled like shockwaves across the globe. Wall Street didn't sleep that night. Commodities traders panicked as African nations halted exports to Western corporations. Gold prices spiked, but supply chains shattered. Cobalt contracts collapsed. Phones went dark in Silicon Valley not from outages, but from fear. France called it an act of economic terrorism. Britain issued a formal protest. And in Washington, chaos reigned. In an emergency meeting at the Pentagon, J.D. Vance stood with a smug sneer. We warned them this would happen if we let that soldier play diplomat. Traore doesn't want justice, he wants revenge. A military advisor cleared his throat. Sir, it's worse than that. He's uniting the South. Latin America's reacting. The global South is calling it the Traore Doctrine. Vance barked, "What doctrine?" The advisor read from the summit transcript. We will not wait for permission to be free. We will not trade dignity for debt. We will no longer let the thief write the history. A long silence followed. President Trump, newly re-emerged on the political stage, slammed his hand on the table. Enough. I built half those regimes. I kept Africa in check. You want to fix this? He pointed to the Joint Chiefs. Send a message. Show him we're still king. But someone else at the table, former President Barack Obama, raised his hand. If we attack Traore now, we turn him into a legend. Trump growled, he already thinks he is. Obama replied, quietly, because no one ever told him he wasn't. Meanwhile, in Bamako, Traore sat alone in the dark, overlooking the Niger River. No guards, no armor, just him and the silence of a people who had trusted him to carry centuries of wounds into one decisive stand. He whispered to the wind. They'll come now. With threats. With bribes. Maybe even bombs. But we won't bend. Behind him, a Malian child approached with a gift, a small wooden carving of a lion, scarred but standing tall. For you, Captain, the boy said. Traore smiled, took the lion, and whispered. The fallout from Timbuktu rippled like shockwaves across the globe. Wall Street didn't sleep that night. Commodities traders panicked as African nations halted exports to Western corporations. Gold prices spiked, but supply chains shattered. Cobalt contracts collapsed. Phones went dark in Silicon Valley, not from outages, but from fear. France called it an act of economic terrorism. Britain issued a formal protest. And in Washington, chaos reigned. In an emergency meeting at the Pentagon, J.D. Vance stood with a smug sneer. We warned them this would happen if we let that soldier play diplomat. Traore doesn't want justice, he wants revenge. A military advisor cleared his throat. Sir, it's worse than that. He's uniting the South. Latin America's reacting. The global South is calling it the Traore Doctrine. Vance barked, "What doctrine?" The advisor read from the summit transcript. We will not wait for permission to be free. We will not trade dignity for debt. We will no longer let the thief write the history. A long silence followed. President Trump, newly re-emerged on the political stage, slammed his hand on the table. Enough. I built half those regimes. I kept Africa in check. You want to fix this? He pointed to the Joint Chiefs. Send a message. Show him we're still king. But someone else at the table, former President Barack Obama, raised his hand. If we attack Traore now, we turn him into a legend. Trump growled, he already thinks he is. Obama replied, quietly, because no one ever told him he wasn't. Meanwhile, in Bamako, Traore sat alone in the dark, overlooking the Niger River. No guards, no armor, just him and the silence of a people who had trusted him to carry centuries of wounds into one decisive stand. He whispered to the wind. They'll come now. With threats. With bribes. Maybe even bombs. But we won't bend. Behind him, a Malian child approached with a gift, a small wooden carving of a lion, scarred but standing tall. For you, Captain, the boy said. Traore smiled, took the lion, and whispered. Let them come. The world held its breath. In New York, the UN General Assembly had never been so tense. Delegates whispered. Allies fidgeted. Enemies plotted. At the center of it all stood Traore, a lone figure from the Sahel who had dared to challenge the very order built on centuries of blood and silence. J.D. Vance entered the chamber late, flanked by American security. His eyes locked on Traore, who stood calm, expression unreadable, gaze like iron. Vance stepped up to the podium. What we are witnessing is not resistance. It's chaos disguised as courage. This man, he pointed directly at Traore, is not a liberator. He is a destabilizer. Cameras flashed. The room shifted. Vance continued. He dares to weaponize history. To punish today's world for yesterday's sins. But America will not bow to guilt. We will not cower to men with loud voices and little wisdom. A murmur swept the assembly. But Traore didn't flinch. When his turn came, he didn't walk, he strode. And when he reached the microphone, the room fell completely silent. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the table. He simply leaned forward and said, "History isn't dead. It's buried. Beneath our lands. Our scars. Our bones. And you," he turned to Vance, "want to dig up gold while ignoring the graves." Gasps echoed through the hall. Traore continued. "You speak of chaos? Look outside. Gaza. Haiti. Congo. Yemen. Whose hands drip with oil, and whose tanks roll over the innocent. You dare call us destabilizers? Then what were you?" He paused. His voice deepened. "You called us savages. Then taught us your savagery. You brought chains, and called it civilization. You stole our names, our gods, our gold, and now, when we rise, you tremble?" Vance stood, fists clenched. But Traore turned back to the crowd. "We will not beg for seats at your table. We will build our own. And when you come, because you will, we will not run. We will not plead. We will not bow." A beat of silence. Then, from the balcony, someone began to clap. Another followed. Then more. Until the entire hall, save for a few stone-faced figures, stood in thunderous applause. Traore looked once more at Vance. And with a quiet smile, said, "Now you know why you fear me."